souls. So I cried through the whole movie, like on and off through the whole movie. We had gone to see Deliver Me From Nowhere a few weeks ago when it opened. It's the new film that looks at Bruce Springsteen's life in like 1981 and 82, which was a particularly difficult, painful, raw time in his life, really hit bottom. And also, which is so often the case, a time that was really transformational. He has just come off of a very successful tour for his 5th recording, The River. He is not quite the superstar that we know now, but he's on his way. And his manager and producer are really eager for him to get that next big hit out. But he wants to go in a different direction. In part, it seems he might be worried about success, about the huge success and what's coming and how it might change him, take his message, reduce his passion. And so he wants to do something that's much more stripped down. Nothing in the studio. It's just going to be him in his guitar in his bedroom with this old recording equipment on a cassette tape. And no surprise, his manager and producer are not excited about this at all. But he insists, and the next release, Nebraska, is made, and it's produced without any press, without any touring, without any, interviews, and it still becomes really a pretty fine success. And if you know, historically, Nebraska has been kind of considered not just one of his great works, but in many ways an American classic. Much different from the kind of loud rock we think of, kind of much more kind of stripped down ballads that were, in this case, really infused and informed by Woody Guthrie and by the short stories of Flannery O'Connor. But two things that were really critical came out of that time in his life, 81 to 82. The first thing was he got the mental health care that he really, really needed. He was young 30s and he had struggled with depression. He'd begun to have like suicidal ideation and fears, and his manager and producer had been with him and supported him, but had gotten to the point to where he realized, he has to have professional help. So he found a psychiatrist and a therapist for him. And Springsteen began working through what was under a lot of that depression and sadness, which was his very troubled relationship with his father, who was an alcoholic, who was mentally ill, had schizophrenia, and who could be extremely erratic and unpredictable and violent, even against both Bruce and his mother. And that's the part, of course, that made me cry on and off. Just seeing this sweet little boy, so innocent, against the really terror and fear of his father, and not just for himself, but this scene, it's just so heartbreaking when he comes down the stairs with a baseball bat, just a little bitty thing, trying to protect his mother, right? But what came out of that was, of course, healing for Bruce, and thank God, right? And reconciliation, even the beginning of that with his father. The second thing that came out of that time that was transformative was Born in the USA. He recorded that single and later the album by that name that came out in 1984 that again, launched him to being the superstar that we all know he is. But it also came with what he had been afraid of, which was losing himself and being misunderstood. Lauren Onkey, who's the NPR music director, referred to Born in the USA, it was on a special called American Anthem on NPR, as the historically most misunderstood song in this country. If you know the song, you know that it came out of concern for Vietnam vets. Springsteen had just done a concert in LA for vets. He had met with vets. He had written a song that was originally titled Vietnam that really tells the kind of unflinching story about vets, right? Sent off to the foreign land to kill the yellow man, and how they come back rejected and unable to find work, nowhere to run, nowhere to go. It evolved, right? Those were the verses, and then of course there was the pulsing chorus that I'm sure even my mother knows, right? Born in the USA. Right? We all know it, right? Okay, I would have sung, right? But save you from that. But that was so open to misinterpretation. Some of you may remember this famously. Ronald Reagan in 1984 with George Will, his consultant, had obviously not listened to the verses and just heard the chorus. And on the campaign tour, Reagan goes to New Jersey and praises Springsteen, who I'm sure has never voted Republican, for his beautiful anthem that celebrates the hopes and dreams of all young men, right? You know, and of course, that's exactly what he had been afraid of, was losing his voice, losing his message, being misunderstood. So today, we come to these passages which are arguably the most misunderstood part of the Christian scripture. This idea that the apocalypse, the end of the world, is really what? The focus of the Christian faith. And for many people, it's like, let's just get rid of this world as quickly as we can, right? Forget about saving the earth or caring for the planet. Let's just get rid of this world so that those chosen few can be raptured and taken up into heaven. I have to be honest, I did not grow up with this at all. Dr. Art Digby, who preached for 26 years, 25 to 30 minutes every sermon with the manuscript, I don't remember this at all. He didn't talk about the end of the world. He talked about changing the world. I can still remember as a little girl him standing up there holding this book, The Economics of Jesus, right, talking about justice in the world. I, as a teenager, went on some of the very first early Habitat for Humanity trips. That's exactly what we grew up thinking, that this world was a treasure of God and we were supposed to care for it. Some of you, I know, did grow up in a church where this kind of rapture was really centered, and you still have the religious scars to show for it, right? My sweet husband grew up in a much more conservative church, and the rapture was kind of right there, front and center, kind of crammed down their throat, and even worse, they had to go to church 3 times a week, right? Twice on Sundays and Wednesday. Thank you for being here today. But it was also terrifying, right? Like, I mean, scarring, like showing kids the communists are coming, the Russians are coming, and showing these films where they're supposed to just like be terrified. It would be hard to really overstate how much damage has been done to people because of this. Again, it's not at all my experience, but I hear people talk to me about it a lot. The religious trauma they suffer and how they just can't seem to shake it. But it's bigger than just the personal trauma, because there is so much in this interpretive world about the end of the world that has just, you know, led to such broad spread oppression, right? This idea that, you know, you tell the slaves, you tell those poor and oppressed, you know, this is just your lot, just don't worry about it, be resigned to it. But the end of the world, you're going to have this wonderful reward in heaven. This world's not really real, right? But there are always voices that speak out and challenge that. There's a group called Indigenous Action, which is an activist group of Native voices. And about 5 years ago, they published this manifesto called Rethinking the Apocalypse, an anti-futurist manifesto. And they were talking about, right, like how these scriptures are used, how these scriptures are used against Native peoples in particular, because there's this us and them, and they're always them, and how the violence in these texts and how this just kind of destruction and desecration of the earth that this kind of thinking really encourages, and the othering of other people. And they have this wonderful line in this manifesto, which is something like, why can so many people imagine the end of the world, but they can't imagine the end of oppressive structures, right? The end of colonialism. And hearing that, it made me think too of other kinds of suffering, like suicide. Like, what kind of world have we created where so many people, from teenage to middle age, right, from the poor to professional athletes, can imagine ending their life, but cannot imagine an end to the isolation and pain they feel, right? I mean, you can kind of go, well, for one thing, we've got policies and politicians who do stuff like get rid of the suicide hotline and get rid of any kind of mental health care now that is targeted towards people of color. Really, messaging that could save people's lives has been scuttled by this person, right? And that's kind of just the truth of what we know. But when you kind of dial it back, and when you look at the truth that while that is true, there are many people who have taken these scriptures and they have misused them, and they have taken them and they have raped people's bodies, right? And exploited people in the name of Christ. When you take that away, there are also wise voices here, kind of newer generations of scholars like womanists and feminists and liberation and eco-justice who say what these scriptures originally about were not the end of the world, but actually the end of empire, right? And they remind us that Christian apocalyptic texts have their roots in what? Jewish apocalyptic texts, like the book of Daniel that was written around the year 165, 170, that 2 centuries, not quite, before the time Jesus walked on the earth. And that was a time when the Jewish people were under the hand of the Hellenistic Empire, when their daily bread was colonialism and conquest and exploitation and endless war and disaster and persecution. And these scriptures represent in many ways their creative voice of resistance. Like all this colorful stuff, it's like saying, we will meet your reign of terror, you SOB, right? With this beautiful vision, right? With this vision of love's embrace. We will meet your monster, you SOB, with visions of angels that are heavenly, loving us and carrying us. We will meet your chaos and confusion with this constant word of God's loving presence. I mean, that's something so different, right? To just kind of say these wild texts that speak about the sun and the moon and the stars falling from the sky and stopping are a way of saying God's presence is going to break in one day and bring a fresh new world for all of us. That's, of course, underneath the spirituals, right? You think about the faith of people whose bodies had been broken and crushed, who had had their children taken from their breast, right? Who still, with their heart and their soul, sang, imagine, freedom's day is mighty sweet. Soon we're gonna meet, right? Who imagined not just Moses wading in the water, they were wading through the water. Right? They were coming through to a new place, right? Who called one another with them, right? Come and go with me to that land, come and go. Right? There'll be freedom and there'll be justice, there'll be no hunger. Who could sing that, right? This soundtrack of justice and hope and resistance, not resignation, not that, no, but in a world where there was no possibility for freedom, they named it and believed it. That's, of course, what Springsteen is doing here, too. 76 years old, right? For 6 decades, he has been giving the world this soundtrack of resistance and hope. That's what he's been doing. And he's had this staying power, as music scholars point out, because his work is unambiguously complicated. He always says the verses, that's where the nitty-gritty, the dirty, the suffering, the blues live, right? That's his hometown. That's the person left behind. That's the struggle for love. But it's in the chorus, right, where we all join together. Right? Our voices lifted in hope, imagining something else different up ahead. And like Anki said, rarely has a man with nowhere to go sounded so triumphant, right? And how do we get there? How in this broken moment where it appears that everything we love is at risk, how do we find the soundtrack of hope for ourselves? I feel like we need peace prescriptions every Sunday when before you walk out the door, me or Paula or Catherine or Eric are handing you a thing. You need a hike, you need a walk, you need to craft, you need to do this. I mean, what are those things that feed us? What are those practices that will help us find our voice and our own soundtrack? And what always, of course, in the bonds of community, in the bonds of breaking down the isolation, in the bonds of reaching out beyond ourselves to bring a world of justice. I cried through that whole movie. I cried into the credits. At the very end, Springsteen is close to being delivered from nowhere, as the title suggests. He's coming off a successful tour, crowds, the chorus, everyone behind him. His parents have come to this concert. A true story. And his father, who is now old and broken, the mental illness has taken its toll, is waiting for his son in this backstage room. His mother asked him to go in and see him. He goes in. His father says something about, how proud we are, how proud, how amazing, and maybe there's a word in there about, I know I wasn't always the father I should be. He's now this broken man who can barely stand. And then he says to Springsteen, come sit on my lap. And he says, no. He says, no, come sit on my lap. And Springsteen says, really, Dad? Come sit on my lap. He says, Dad, but I'm sweaty and I'm hot and I'm 32. And his dad says, come sit on my lap. And he goes over, and there's this moment that is really awkward. His father is smaller, Springsteen's bigger. He sits down on his dad's lap. His dad says, there, something like it feels good. And Springsteen says, this is the first time in my life I have ever sat on your lap. His dad says, no, really? He says, this is the first time I've ever sat on your lap. Faith calls us, right? A sacred story, with song, with those who somehow have gone before us, those who are walking by us, those before us who we owe so much to. It calls all of us to think about, what is that land of hope and dreams where we're called to live? I know what it is for me, right? A world where no child is the hunter or the hunted. A world where every child and every person feels cherished and valued and safe and protected and loved and nourished. May it be so. Amen.